We are in a depression and nobody's talking about it because the stock market is doing great and unemployment rates are fine. So, what I'd like to do is discuss how I got to this conclusion and get your opinions on this. I do think it's important to note that I don't think we can compare the current situation that we are in to the Great Depression because there's just too many different variables, but I do think what we can call right now is a depression. Let's get into it. So, how did the Great Depression happen? Unfortunately, the unemployment rate was 25% during the time of the Great Depression. This came from a plethora of things happening that just molded together in a way that fucked us over. Okay? That's the nice way to put it. The gold standard came into effect, which put rigid rules on how money is operating, right? So banks actually were forced to shut down the idea of printing money. Sounds like a great idea, right? However, this caused deflation in the economy, and that's a different problem, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, when it comes to the stock market that really set up the global depression, that happened because too many people invested into the market when they didn't really have enough money, and unfortunately that wiped out billions of dollars, and industrial complexes had to collapse essentially, and credit froze, meaning you couldn't borrow. Businesses felt uncomfortable, incompetent, no confidence whatsoever, so they laid off a bunch of people, they cut hours, and they cut wages as well. So, factor in tariffs setting in from both America and other countries. That was about 1930. So that made everything worse, honestly. So let's talk about the deflation situation. So deflation, unfortunately, made it to where businesses had to bring down their prices so much that they were no longer making any profit whatsoever and were barely even paying their own supplies. That's why deflation is a problem in itself. If there's a little bit of deflation, that's fine. However, this was a drastic deflation issue. And lo and behold, Great Depression. Whirlwind of problems, right? Solutions to the Great Depression. So most of us who have studied history appropriately know that President Roosevelt created the New Deal, which had two main implications that tried to help the Great Depression. One of them was creating jobs through the WPA and the CCC, which was infrastructure jobs, so building bridges, roads, buildings, etc. The other one was dropping the gold standard, which allowed banks to start printing money again, helping inflation rather than deflation. This allowed for spenders and consumers and business owners to feel more confident in the market, allowing them to stop hoarding their money, essentially. Also, World War II. Okay, this helped dramatically because the federal government put in a lot of financial deficits for military gear, which allowed private sector factories to mass hire as they just worked into full gear. So it dropped laws that prevented women from working. So that was cool too. So some of the positive aspects during this time frame compared to us, it's nuanced, okay? You can argue the negatives, the net positives, the pros, the cons, whatever, but I do want to talk about it because some of this is very important to compare. So, home ownership. 65% of Americans owned their own home back in the Great Depression, which is fantastic for your personal financial growth and your own personal net worth, your equity, etc. Okay, this is a benefit. This is a financial benefit to own your own home, right? Also, you only needed one income to survive. There were a lot of laws forcing women to stay home and not work, but that's not the point. The point is you only needed one income to survive. That's a positive. Purchasing power soared, however, people didn't feel confident in purchasing because they never knew if they were going to lose their job, so they just hoarded or gave their extra money to people who needed it more. Also, technically, you could argue that community members really stuck out and tried helping their fellow neighbors, but there was also a lot of violence. A lot of people died during this time. And unfortunately, the Hispanic community got hit hard. There was about 400,000 deportations during this time because, racism and apparently this is your fault, Hispanics. When are we ever going to learn that it's not the Hispanics? So, where are we currently? Now, I need to preface that I'm going to read some of the facts because there's a lot here that I think we need to address to even try to compare the situation between the Great Depression and now and show why we are currently in a depression. So, let's start with 80% of Americans right now have no fun money. 80% of Americans have no fun money. And the reason why economists are not necessarily paying attention to these numbers is specifically because when they average all of the income that people are receiving, 20% of the population is making easily like 100 times more than the 80% population, which skews the average number drastically, making it to where we don't pay attention to the 80% of the population that is struggling right now. Surviving or dying is the 80% population, whereas the 20% population is doing great, thriving. What's your problem? Poor? Poverty? Pfft, I don't care. I'm doing fine. You're the problem. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Anyways, I want to point out that this is going to be probably multiple different reels, but home ownership, renting, that is 50% of your net income, which is incredibly insane. 30% rise in grocery prices in just 3 years, and in some places there is a 70% rise in grocery prices. Ultra insane. Medical costs up the yin yang. Thanks insurance companies, and thanks the Trump administration for like taking all of the regulations away back in 2016. That's wonderful. Also, because affordability is so tight on people are getting credit cards that they can't afford, and the credit card companies are like, cool, more interest, more money for us, not realizing that this is actually going to cause a similar issue to the 2008 banking crisis, because like these people can't afford their debt and you're still giving it to them in the hopes and ideas that you're going to get that paid back, which is not how this is going to work, because it's bad right now. And it's going to get worse because this is happening more often. Let's see. Personal savings. I'm gonna cut this here, and then we'll get into the rest. So personal savings. Normal savings rates is about 9%. So typically 70% of the population can save about 9% of their paycheck after taxes and everything, right? So that's not a lot, but 9% is what the typical average rate of savings is. Now, only about 56 to 60% of the population can save, and that 56 to 60% of the population can actually only save about 3% of their paycheck after taxes and expenses, which, not good, not demure. This is showing where we are economically, and I know those numbers don't seem drastic, but they are. I promise you those are actually a significant issue, on top of the fact that the government doesn't give a shit about us. They have been very outspoken about, like, you're on your own. We're thriving. We're becoming billionaires. Why would you be complaining about this? So they have no plans to change. In fact, they're making things worse, specifically through tariffs and the Iran war. So unlike in the Great Depression, when the war actually benefited the economy, this war is a detriment to the economy because it unfortunately has drastically impacted our energy supplies and our food supplies. So people are going to starve. People are probably going to go cold, or hot. Doesn't matter. Either way, it's a bad thing. So I just want to point out that the Iran war is the exact opposite of the Great Depression war and how it got us out of the depression. In fact, this Iran war actually might push us further into a depression. Now, let's talk about monopolies. Monopolies got legalized in the 80s and have basically essentially eliminated competitive pricing, but we have the illusion that we have competitive pricing because basically the same company owns all of these different products that are only like a couple cents different. So, competitive pricing, gone. They don't really have to worry about that. Or you're gonna still buy my shit. AI data centers, they're forcing the bill onto us rather than having the billionaires pay for it, knowing full well that they couldn't pay for it. Like, they knew all along that they were going to foot the bill onto us. That's cool. Love that. Let's see. National debt is rising. So the federal national debt is rising, which is squeezing and limiting the funds for social services and grants for public benefit nonprofits. That's cool. Love that. 500% rise in our tax burden since the Great Depression. So beforehand, there was about a 4% tax rate from your income, and nowadays it's actually like a 36 to 40% increase, tax rate for your income compared to a billionaire who might pay 6% of their income in taxes. I will finish this next clip, I promise. I'm so sorry. Okay, hopefully this is the last clip. But 40% homeownership rate right now. That's incredibly low. Only 40% of Americans own their own home right now. That's bad. And the reason why that is bad is because home ownership is wealth. It builds equity, it builds net worth, it builds financial investment opportunities. There are so many reasons as to why owning your own home and owning your own property is incredibly important, but here's the issue. 11 million vacant homes are just sitting out there doing nothing but sitting. Okay, we can talk about that later. I would love to talk about that later. Let's get into the rental aspect for seniors, okay? If you are a senior and don't own your own home, or were forced to sell your home, and then you're forced to rent, you then have to put your Social Security paycheck into that. And if you haven't been able to do, like, to save up for retirement, you're screwed. You don't have money. You don't have money to live. So you have to pay for a rental that you can't afford because you have no choices. Because you didn't get to buy a home, or you had to sell the home because you couldn't afford life. Like, that's not okay. That is not the world we should be living in. Now, let's look at some possible positivities, okay? We have more amenities, okay? We have cool tech now, lots of really cool things to distract us. Ooh, shiny, shiny, shiny. However, that tech stuff is kind of required in our society now, and it's really expensive when it's all bundled up together, but it is cheaper than it used to be if you buy them individually. Also, more safety nets. So there's a lot more social services. There's a lot more opportunities to be helped if you're in crisis. It's just those services are kind of hard to get into. They're annoying to deal with, like bureaucracy shit, right? But at least we have them compared to the Great Depression. Better healthcare and education, even though it's 500% more expensive to go to school and 5,700% more expensive to get health care, while only getting a 42% raise in income. That's great. Social change, though, also needs work. But social change. Anyways, think of the positives. Have a good day.